They came without warning. No transmission, no demand, no declaration of war. Just shadow, a shadow so large it swallowed the sun over 3 continents simultaneously. A shadow that didn't move like weather, didn't behave like clouds, didn't register on civilian radar until it was already too late to matter. And in the span of 11 minutes, every space-based defense platform humanity had spent 40 years building went dark. Not destroyed, not disabled. Switched off, like a child flicking a light switch before bed. That was the first message the Veil Theory Empire sent to the human race. Not words, not fire, just a demonstration so effortless, so casual, so utterly contemptuous, that half of Earth's military command didn't even scramble fighters. They just sat there, staring at their dead screens, trying to understand what they were looking at. The other half scrambled anyway. Those ones, at least, still remembered what it meant to be human. Beat. Pause. Let it breathe. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I was there. I was standing on the roof of a hospital in Nairobi when the sky turned the color of a dying coal, deep red at the edges, black at the center, pulsing like something alive. The air smelled like ozone and something else, something older, something that made your brain reach for a word it didn't have. Children stopped crying. Dogs went silent. Even the wind stopped. And then the voice came, not from speakers, not from screens. It arrived inside your head, in whatever language you thought in whatever voice would frighten you most. For me it was calm, measured, like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis with the emotional investment of a man reading a grocery list. Biological designate. Human. Classification. Pre-galactic. Threat index. Negligible. You've been assessed. The Veil Theory Dominion hereby claims the system under Expansion Protocol 7. Compliance is expected within 72 of your planetary hours. Resistance is not advised. It is merely delayed extinction. That was it. No negotiation. No list of demands. No explanation of what compliance even meant. 72 hours. And then silence. Tone shift. Urgent. Almost angry now. Within the first hour, 17 governments attempted contact, tight beam transmissions, old radio frequencies, mathematical sequences. Every protocol humans had ever theorized for first contact fired into the belly of those ships like prayers. Nothing came back. Within 3 hours, the United Earth Council was an emergency session. 41 world leaders in one room, most of them pale, several of them visibly shaking, all of them waiting for someone else to speak first. The Secretary General, a woman named Adiz Nwofer, who had spent 30 years in diplomacy and had never once raised her voice in a formal session, stood up. She didn't have notes. She didn't need them. She said 7 words. We cannot surrender what we cannot measure. The room went quiet in a different way then. Not the quiet of fear. The quiet of something waking up. Because she was right. They hadn't told us what they wanted. They hadn't told us what survival looked like under their rule. They hadn't told us anything. And that silence wasn't mercy. It wasn't even arrogance. It was indifference. They didn't explain their terms for the same reason you don't explain to an ant colony why you're building a patio. And that realization, that specific, stomach-dropping realization, hit every person in that room at the same moment. We were not being conquered. We were being cleared. Engagement line. If that line just hit you like a freight train, comment, "We do not clear right now." Let's see how many humans are watching. Story continues, heat rising. 38 hours into the 72-hour window, something extraordinary happened. Not a battle, not a weapon, a broadcast. It came from a single civilian radio station in rural Iceland, a station with a range of maybe 200 kilometers, run by a retired engineer named Gunnar Sigurdsson, who was 71 years old, half-deaf, and absolutely furious. He didn't transmit to the ships. He transmitted to us. He read poetry, old poetry, Icelandic sagas, passages from Homer, lines from Pablo Neruda, a section of the Mahabharata, a verse from Langston Hughes. His voice was rough and cracked and completely unafraid. He read for 6 hours straight. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. Within 40 minutes, other stations picked it up Within 3 hours, it was on every frequency on the planet. Within 6 hours, people who had been hiding in shelters were sitting in the dark with tears running down their faces, listening to an old man in Iceland remind them what they were. The Veil Theory recorded it, of course. Their cultural analysis algorithms processed it in approximately 0.3 seconds and classified it as pre-rational emotional signaling. Irrelevant. They were wrong. It was the first shot of the war. Final beat. Chapter close. Cliffhanger building. With 9 hours left on the clock, the United Earth Council sent its official response to the Veil Theory Dominion. Not a surrender. Not a plea. A single line. Transmitted on every frequency, in every language spoken on Earth, broadcast so loud and so wide that it rattled the sensor arrays on ships that had crossed for 100 light years to be here. Humanity declines. 3 seconds of silence followed. And then, from the largest of the Veil Theory vessels, a ship the size of a small moon, a ship that had not moved or reacted to anything in 38 hours, a new transmission came. Just one word. Just one. But this time, there was something in it that hadn't been there before. The cultural translation algorithms would later debate what it was for years. The soldiers who heard it called it something simpler. They called it interest. And in the halls of the most powerful empire the galaxy had ever produced, for the first time in 11,000 years, something looked at humanity and did not look away. They found her in Cell Block 9 of the Reykjavik Military Detention Facility, not because it was a prestigious prison, not because it was secure, but because it was the only facility on the planet that still had power, still had guards, and still had anyone paying attention to something as mundane as incarceration when alien ships the size of continents were parked in low orbit above 3 of Earth's largest cities. Her name was Commander Yara Voss, 44 years old, former head of the United Earth Strategic Asymmetric Warfare Division, a department so classified that most of the generals currently sitting in that emergency council session had never heard of it. Former instructor at the Mars Defense Academy, former architect of the Callisto Doctrine, a theoretical framework for fighting a technologically superior enemy that every senior officer had read, quietly admired, and then officially dismissed as dangerously unhinged. She had been in that cell for 14 months, not for cowardice, not for treason, for being right too early. 3 years before the Veil Theory arrived, Yara Voss had stood in front of the Joint Military Council and told them something they didn't want to hear. She had said, "We are not alone, and whatever finds us first will not find us ready. And if we are not ready, being almost ready is the same as being dead." She had submitted a proposal. Project SCAR, Strategic Capacity for Asymmetric Response. A complete restructuring of Earth's military doctrine away from conventional deterrence and towards something uglier, decentralized, unpredictable, built not on the assumption of technological parity, but on its complete absence. She wanted to train soldiers to fight like they had already lost everything, because she believed that was exactly the situation they would one day be in. The council had thanked her for her service, buried the proposal in a classified archive, and 18 months later arrested her on charges of unauthorized contact with foreign intelligence services. Charges so thin they dissolve in court. But by then it didn't matter. Her clearances were gone. Her division was disbanded. Her name was removed from the buildings it had been on. She sat in her cell and she waited, because Yara Voss was many things. But more than anything else, she was patient. The man they sent to get her was not a soldier. He was a data analyst named Preet Soni, 29 years old, still wearing the lanyard from the council's emergency session, visibly sleep-deprived, and carrying a tablet that showed she could see it from across the cell before he even unlocked the door. Casualty projections. He didn't introduce himself. He just held up the tablet. She looked at it for 4 seconds. Then she said, 72-hour window? He nodded. How much time is left? 9 hours, 14 minutes. She was quiet for a moment, not thinking. She had already thought all of this. She had thought all of this 3 years ago in a conference room, while men with more medals than sense told her she was paranoid. Who authorized my release? Secretary General Wolfer. Yara nodded slowly. She stood up. picked up the single book she had been allowed in her cell, a worn, annotated copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, every margin filled with her own cramped handwriting, and walked to the door. She stopped just before the threshold. "Tell me one thing," she said, when they spoke. "The transmission. Was there fear in it?" Preet looked confused. "Our linguist said the closest translation was indifference, clinical detachment." Yara smiled, and it was not a warm smile. "Good," she said. "Indifference makes mistakes. Fear doesn't." And she walked out of the cell. If you already know Yara Voss is going to be one of the greatest characters you've ever heard, comment Voss right now. She's just getting started. She walked into the United Earth Council session 40 minutes later, still in her detention clothes, still holding her book, with Preet 3 steps behind her trying to keep up. The room went silent. Not the silence of respect. The silence of people who had made a decision they weren't sure about and were suddenly being confronted with its consequences. General Haruki Mays, current Chief of Combined Forces, the man who had signed the order that put her in that cell, stood up slowly. He was 62, decorated. "Careful. Commander Voss," he said, "you should know that your release is conditional, and your presence here is purely." "How many ships?" she said. He stopped. "I'm sorry. Their fleet. How many vessels have you counted in orbit?" A pause. "Our current estimate is 417 distinct." "Wrong," she said. She walked to the central display, without being invited, and pulled up the sensor data herself. "You're counting heat signatures as individual vessels. These clusters here, and here, are drone screens, autonomous subunits. They read as ships because they're designed to. Strip them out." Her fingers moved across the display. The number changed. 417 became 61. The room held its breath. 61 capital ships, she said, which means this is not their invasion fleet. This is their assessment team. The word hung in the air like smoke. Assessment. General Mays' voice was very quiet. "What does that mean?" Yara turned around, looked at the room. 41 world leaders, dozens of generals and advisors, the most powerful decision-making body in human history, all of them staring at her like she was the only light in a very dark room. "It means they haven't decided to destroy us yet," she said. "It means they sent 61 ships to look at us the same way you'd send a scout before a hunting party." She set her book down on the table. "And it means we have a window, small, probably the only one we'll ever get, to make them question whether the hunt is worth the cost." Secretary General Nwolfer leaned forward. "How?" Yara opened her book, not to read it, just the gesture of it, the habit of someone who had thought about this moment for a very long time. "We don't fight to win," she said. "Not yet. We fight to be remembered. We fight to make every sensor array on those 61 ships send one message back to whatever empire is waiting behind them." "What message?" Nwolfer asked. Yara looked up. "That we are going to be expensive." And that was the moment the war actually began. Not with a weapon, not with a battle, with a single word from a woman who had been locked in a cell for 14 months, and had spent every single day of it planning for this. Final sequence. The plan begins to take shape. They gave her 6 hours. 6 hours to present a plan to the council. 6 hours to convince 41 governments, 17 military commands, and one deeply skeptical chief of combined forces that the woman they had imprisoned for being too aggressive was now their only hope. She used 4 of them. The plan she presented was not elegant. It was not reassuring. It did not come with projected casualty figures in single digits or optimistic timelines or the kind of clean strategic language that made politicians feel like the situation was under control. It came with one slide. One slide, black background, white text, 6 words. "We survive by becoming their problem." General Mays read it, read it again, looked up at her. "This is not a battle plan," he said. "This is a philosophy." "Yes," she said. "Every battle plan they have ever written assumes the enemy wants to live more than they want to win. I am telling you, and I need every person in this room to genuinely understand this before they agree to it. I am telling you that we are going to build an army that wants to win more than it wants to survive." The silence was different this time, heavier, because every person in that room understood on a cellular level what she was describing. She wasn't talking about suicide missions. She was talking about something far more dangerous. She was talking about faith, the unshakable, irrational, galvanizing human belief that even when everything says you should stop, you don't. Even when the math says you've already lost, you fight. Even when the most powerful empire in the history of the galaxy is parked above your cities and has given you 9 hours to comply, you look up at those ships and you decline. The council voted at 3:47 in the morning. The result was unanimous. And somewhere in the belly of a Veil Theory assessment vessel, a sensor array recorded an unusual spike in coordinated human activity and flagged it for review. The review algorithm considered it for 0.6 seconds and classified it as irrelevant. They were wrong again. And this time, it was going to cost them. They found her in cell block 9 of the Reykjavik military detention facility. Not because it was a prestigious prison, not because it was secure, but because it was the only facility on the planet that still had power, still had guards, and still had anyone paying attention to something as mundane as incarceration when alien ships the size of continents were parked in low orbit above 3 of Earth's largest cities. Her name was Commander Yara Voss, 44 years old, former head of the United Earth Strategic Asymmetric Warfare Division, a department so classified that most of the generals currently sitting in that emergency council session had never heard of it. Former instructor at the Mars Defense Academy. Former architect of the Callisto Doctrine, a theoretical framework for fighting a technologically superior enemy that every senior officer had read, quietly admired, and then officially dismissed as dangerously unhinged. She had been in that cell for 14 months. Not for cowardice, not for treason, for being right too early. 3 years before the Veil Theory arrived, Yara Voss had stood in front of the Joint Military Council and told them something they didn't want to hear. She had said, "We are not alone, and whatever finds us first will not find us ready. And if we are not ready, being almost ready is the same as being dead." She had submitted a proposal. Project SCAR, Strategic Capacity for Asymmetric Response. A complete restructuring of Earth's military doctrine away from conventional deterrence and towards something uglier, decentralized, unpredictable, built not on the assumption of technological parity, but on its complete absence. She wanted to train soldiers to fight like they had already lost everything, because she believed that was exactly the situation they would one day be in. The council had thanked her for her service, buried the proposal in a classified archive, and 18 months later, arrested her on charges of unauthorized contact with foreign intelligence services. Charges so thin they dissolve in court. But by then it didn't matter. Her clearances were gone. Her division was disbanded. Her name was removed from the buildings it had been on. She sat in her cell, and she waited, because Yara Voss was many things. But more than anything else, she was patient. The man they sent to get her was not a soldier. He was a data analyst named Preet Soni, 29 years old, still wearing a lanyard from the council's emergency session, visibly sleep-deprived, and carrying a tablet that showed she could see it from across the cell before he even unlocked the door. Casualty projections. He didn't introduce himself. He just held up the tablet. She looked at it for 4 seconds. Then she said, 72-hour window? He nodded. How much time is left? 9 hours, 14 minutes. She was quiet for a moment, not thinking. She had already thought all of this. She had thought all of this 3 years ago in a conference room, while men with more medals and sense told her she was paranoid. Who authorized my release? Secretary General Wolfer. Yara nodded slowly. She stood up, picked up the single book she had been allowed in her cell, a worn, annotated copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, every margin filled with her own cramped handwriting, and walked to the door. She stopped just before the threshold. "Tell me one thing," she said. When they spoke, the transmission, was there fear in it? Preet looked confused. Our linguist said the closest translation was indifference, clinical detachment. Yara smiled, and it was not a warm smile. "Good," she said. "Indifference makes mistakes. Fear doesn't." And she walked out of the cell. If you already know Yara Voss is going to be one of the greatest characters you've ever heard, comment Voss right now. She's just getting started. She walked into the United Earth Council session 40 minutes later, still in her detention clothes, still holding her book, with Preet 3 steps behind her trying to keep up. The room went silent. Not the silence of respect. The silence of people who had made a decision they weren't sure about and were suddenly being confronted with its consequences. General Haruki Mays, current Chief of Combined Forces, the man who had signed the order that put her in that cell, stood up slowly. He was 62, decorated, careful. "Commander Voss," he said, "you should know that your release is conditional, and your presence here is purely—" "How many ships?" she said. He stopped. "I'm sorry. Their fleet. How many vessels have you counted in orbit?" A pause. "Our current estimate is 417 distinct." "Wrong," she said. She walked to the central display without being invited and pulled up the sensor data herself. "You're counting heat signatures as individual vessels. These clusters here and here are drone screens, autonomous subunits. They read as ships because they're designed to. Strip them out." Her fingers moved across the display. The number changed. 417 became 61. The room held its breath. 61 capital ships, she said, "which means this is not their invasion fleet. This is their assessment team." The word hung in the air like smoke. Assessment. General Mays' voice was very quiet. "What does that mean?" Yara turned around, looked at the room. 41 world leaders, dozens of generals and advisors, the most powerful decision-making body in human history. All of them staring at her like she was the only light in a very dark room. "It means they haven't decided to destroy us yet," she said. "It means they sent 61 ships to look at us the same way you'd send a scout before a hunting party." She set her book down on the table. "And it means we have a window. Small. Probably the only one we'll ever get. To make them question whether the hunt is worth the cost." Secretary General Nwolfer leaned forward. "How?" Yara opened her book, not to read it, just the gesture of it, the habit of someone who had thought about this moment for a very long time. "We don't fight to win," she said. "Not yet. We fight to be remembered. We fight to make every sensor array on those 61 ships send one message back to whatever empire is waiting behind them." "What message?" Nwolfer asked. Yara looked up. "That we are going to be expensive." And that was the moment the war actually began. Not with a weapon, not with a battle, with a single word from a woman who'd been locked in a cell for 14 months, and had spent every single day of it planning for this. They gave her 6 hours. 6 hours to present a plan to the council. 6 hours to convince 41 governments, 17 military commands, and one deeply skeptical chief of combined forces that the woman they had imprisoned for being too aggressive was now their only hope. She used 4 of them. The plan she presented was not elegant. It was not reassuring. It did not come with projected casualty figures in the single digits or optimistic timelines, or the kind of clean strategic language that made politicians feel like the situation was under control. It came with one slide. One slide, black background, white text, 6 words. "We survive by becoming their problem." General Mays read it, read it again, looked up at her. "This is not a battle plan," he said. "This is a philosophy." "Yes," she said. "Every battle plan they have ever written assumes the enemy wants to live more than they want to win. I am telling you, and I need every person in this room to genuinely understand this before they agree to it. I am telling you that we are going to build an army that wants to win more than it wants to survive." The silence was different this time, heavier, because every person in that room understood, on a cellular level, what she was describing. She wasn't talking about suicide missions. She was talking about something far more dangerous. She was talking about faith, the unshakable, irrational, galvanizing human belief that even when everything says you should stop, you don't. Even when the math says you've already lost, you fight. Even when the most powerful empire in the history of the galaxy is parked above your cities and has given you 9 hours to comply, you look up at those ships and you decline. The council voted at 3:47 in the morning. The result was unanimous. And somewhere in the belly of a Veil Theory assessment vessel, a sensor array recorded an unusual spike in coordinated human activity and flagged it for review. The review algorithm considered it for 0.6 seconds and classified it as irrelevant. They were wrong again. And this time, it was going to cost them. The first battle lasted 11 minutes. Not because it ended quickly, because that was how long Yara needed it to last. Exactly 11 minutes. Not 10, not 12. 11, chosen with the kind of cold, specific precision that made the 17 cell commanders who knew the number stare at it on their briefing sheets and feel something uncomfortable move through them. Because 11 minutes was not enough time to win anything, but it was exactly enough time to be remembered. It began on a Tuesday, not a significant Tuesday, not the anniversary of anything, not a date chosen for symbolism or momentum or morale. A Tuesday chosen because the Veil Theory sensor rotation had a 4.7-second gap in its eastern hemisphere coverage every 72 hours, and the next occurrence of that gap fell on a Tuesday. And Yara Voss did not believe in symbolism when mathematics was available. The target was not a ship. The target was a feeling. Specifically, the feeling inside the Veil Theory command structure that humanity was behaving exactly as predicted, compliant in posture, passive in action, a species going through motions of resistance the way a cornered animal bares its teeth, reflexively, uselessly, without any real capacity to follow through. Yara needed them to keep feeling that. She needed them to watch the first battle and see exactly what they expected to see. A desperate, disorganized, technologically outmatched species throwing itself at a wall it couldn't break, and failing. She needed them to watch humanity bleed, and she needed that bleeding to look real, because it was. Strike Cell 12 launched from a converted fishing trawler 40 kilometers off the coast of what used to be called the South China Sea. 8 people, 3 modified atmospheric fighters, the kind that had been Earth's frontline air superiority platform before the Veil Theory arrived and made the concept of air superiority feel quaint. Loaded with every electronic warfare package humanity's engineers have been able to retrofit in 6 weeks of desperate, sleepless labor. Their pilot was a 23-year-old named Tomas Reyes who had qualified for the program 8 days ago and had logged exactly 4 hours in a modified atmospheric fighter before today. He knew what the mission was. He knew what it required. He had read the briefing sheet 3 times, folded it carefully, put it in his pocket, and not spoken about again. The cell commander, a former naval officer named Keiko Yamada, had given him the same words Yara had filtered down through every cell. The same words that had been quietly spreading through the entire resistance structure for 6 weeks like a current running beneath still water. You are not fighting to win this battle. You are fighting to build the next one. Everything you do in the next 11 minutes is a brick in a wall the enemy doesn't know we're building. Lay your brick. That is all. Lay your brick. Tomas had read it, nodded, gone to sleep. Keiko had watched him sleep and understood, in a way that bypassed language entirely, exactly what kind of people Yara Voss had found and what exactly she had asked them to become. The galaxy was not prepared for what humans would do next. Minute 1. Strike cells 4, 12, and 27 launched simultaneously from 3 different continents. The electromagnetic signatures of their launches, carefully tuned to match the ghost architecture decoys humanity had been broadcasting for weeks, registered on Veil Theory sensors as exactly the kind of disorganized, fragmented military response their models had predicted. The Veil Theory response was immediate and almost casual. 2 interceptor drones peeled away from the assessment fleet. Not capital ships, not weapons platforms. Interceptor drones, the Veil Theory equivalent of sending a security guard to deal with a noise complaint. That was the first data point Yara needed. They're not taking us seriously. Minute 3. The 3 cells split into 9 individual units, each one breaking in a different direction, each one broadcasting a different false target signature, each one behaving, to any sensor array watching, like a separate, uncoordinated element of a panicking military that had no idea what the other units were doing. The Veil Theory drones split to follow. That was the second data point. Their response protocol is divide and pursue. They separate to match our separation. Minute 5. Tomas Reyes did something that was not in his briefing sheet. He turned his fighter around, not to retreat, not to run. He turned around and flew directly at the nearest interceptor drone. No weapons, no electronic countermeasures. Just a battered atmospheric fighter moving at full thrust directly toward a piece of Veil Theory technology that could reduce him to component atoms in approximately 0.4 seconds. Keiko saw it on her display and felt her heart stop. Reyes, were you? Data point. He said over the comm. His voice was calm. Completely, unnaturally calm. If I get within 500 meters before it responds, their minimum engagement range is longer than their sensors suggest. That's useful. Reyes, that's not. 400 meters, he said. A pause. 300. The drone fired at 260 meters. Tomas wasn't there anymore. He had broken left at 280, pushed his fighter into a maneuver that the atmospheric platform was not rated for, that the laws of aerodynamics suggested was inadvisable, and that his body, pulling forces that made his vision tunnel and his hands shake, somehow survived. The drone shot went wide. Minimum engagement range, 260 meters, he said, breathing hard now. Keiko, that's in the gap. That's inside the gap. Keiko stared at her display. He was right. 260 meters was inside the gap that Ghost Architecture team had theorized existed in Veil Theory drone coverage. A theoretical blind spot. Unconfirmed. Considered too dangerous to test. Tomas had just confirmed it. With his body. If Tomas Reyes just became one of your favorite characters in any story you've ever heard, comment Reyes below. Because what happens next is going to hurt. Minute 7. Strike Cell4 was gone. Not damaged. Not retreating. Gone. A second Veil Theory interceptor. One that hadn't appeared on any sensor array until it was already firing, had emerged from behind the moon's shadow and engaged Cell4 before they had any time to respond. 3 people, 3 fighters, 11 weeks of training, and a lifetime of everything else. Gone in 0.4 seconds. Keiko got the notification on her display as a simple red indicator. No sound, no detail, just a cell number turning from green to red. She stared at it for 2 seconds. Then she kept working, because that was also in the briefing, not the specific loss. Yara hadn't known which cells would be lost, but the fact of loss, the certainty of it, the instruction that came with it, written in Yara's precise, unsentimental handwriting. When you lose people, you will want to stop. You will want to grieve, to rage, to break. You are permitted to feel all of those things. You are not permitted to let them stop you. Not yet. Grief is the fuel. But this is not the moment to burn it. Hold it. We will need it later. Keiko held it. Minute 9. The remaining cells had done what they came to do. Every sensor sweep. Every engagement distance. Every response time. Every tactical pattern the Veil Theory drones had displayed in 9 minutes of combat was now recorded, analyzed in real time by 3 separate data teams in 3 separate underground locations, and feeding directly into the model that Ghost Architecture was building. Not a model of how to defeat the Veil Theory. Not yet. A model of how they thought, how they predicted, how they responded, how their perfect 11,000-year-old military doctrine expressed itself in the first 9 minutes of contact with an enemy it had already dismissed. Every move they made was a word. Humanity was learning their language. Minute 10. Tomas Reyes found the blind spot. He flew his battered, groaning, structurally compromised atmospheric fighter into the 260-meter gap in the drone's coverage, held his position for exactly 4 seconds. For seconds that felt, he would later say, like standing in the eye of something enormous and utterly indifferent, and took 17 photographs with a sensor array that had been cobbled together from components that had no business being in an aircraft. 17 photographs of a Veil Theory interceptor drone at point-blank range. Its hull composition, its thruster configuration, its weapon array geometry, its sensor placement. 17 photographs that were worth more than anything else humanity had managed to gather in the entire 6 weeks since the Veil Theory arrived. He pulled out of the blind spot at second 4.5. The drone fired at second 5, and that was the moment everything changed. Not because humanity had won, because they hadn't. Minute 11. Yara's calm crackled from her underground command post 700 meters beneath the surface of what used to be a logistics warehouse in northern Finland. Cells 4 and 19 are dark, said the voice on the other end. Flat, professional. The voice of someone doing the same thing Keiko was doing. Holding it. 6 people. Dark was the word they used. Clean. Surgical. It didn't bleed the way other words bled. But Yara knew what dark meant. Data package received. All confirmed. 17 photographs from Cell 12. Drone response pattern from Cell 27. Engagement distance confirmation from. Good, she said. Stand down all remaining cells. Recovery protocol. A pause. Commander, the Council is going to want to report. They're going to ask what we gained. Yara was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the photographs Tomas had taken. 17 images of technology that no human had ever seen this close. Technology that was, by any rational measure, so far beyond anything humanity possessed that the gap between them was almost philosophical. Almost. Tell the Council we gained everything we needed, she said. And what did we lose? She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. 6 people, she said. Tell them we lost 6 people. Say their names. Don't let them become a number. She opened her eyes. And tell them the Veil Theory just filed this battle in their compendium under entry 413. Disorganized primitive resistance. Negligible tactical value. Threat assessment unchanged. Another pause. Is that good? Yara looked at the photographs again. At the blind spot. At the gap in coverage that Tomas Reyes had confirmed with his body at 260 meters. At the language she was learning. At the wall that 6 people had died laying bricks for. It's perfect, she said. In the Veil Theory assessment fleet, a senior analyst reviewed the battle data and submitted a report to the Dominion High Command. The report was 3 lines long. It said, minimal resistance encountered. Human military capacity confirmed as negligible. Recommend proceeding to Phase 2 of Expansion Protocol 7. It was approved in 40 seconds. Phase 2 authorization was transmitted, and somewhere in the expanding darkness between stars, something much larger than 61 ships turned toward Earth and began to move. Yara Voss had wanted to make humanity expensive. She was about to find out exactly what the price would be. Hey, we're watching. Not just a Veil Theory. Not just the 61 ships holding position above Earth, like a sentence waiting to be finished. Others were watching too, eyes that had learned, over centuries, how to watch without being seen, how to observe without registering on any sensor array, how to exist in the margins of the Veil Theory Dominion so quietly, so carefully, so completely without disruption, that the Empire had long since stopped looking at them at all. These were the species that had already lost, the ones who had stood where humanity was standing now, that specific, terrible coordinates of receiving an ultimatum from something so much larger than yourself that the rational response and the suicidal response looked identical. The ones who had done the math, seen the numbers, felt the weight of those ships pressing down on their atmosphere, and complied, not because they were cowards, because they were alone. And humanity, without knowing it, without planning it, without any strategic intent behind the simple act of saying 2 words into the dark, had just done something that none of those species had ever managed to do. It had made them feel less alone. The Korathi had no direct English translation for their own name. The closest approximation, assembled painstakingly by a xenolinguistics team that wouldn't exist for another few months, was something like, those who remember the light. They were small, physically unimpressive by almost any metric. Their homeworld, Velshera, had been absorbed into the Veil Theory Dominion 300 years ago with such minimal administrative friction that the campaign didn't even have its own entry in the Dominion's expansion records. Just a footnote, a coordinate, a species designation, followed by a single word, acquired. The Korathi had no fleet anymore, no weapons, no formal military structure of any kind. Under Dominion Administrative Code, they were classified as a Grade 4 dependent species, meaning they were considered incapable of autonomous governance, and were administered directly by a Veil Theory regional office that processed their existence the way a municipal department processes utility bills, efficiently, without interest, without malice, without ever once considering that something might be happening underneath the paperwork. The Korathi had a tradition, old beyond counting. In every generation, one individual was designated a rememberer, a single person whose sole function was to carry the complete unwritten history of their species inside themselves. Every battle, every loss, every narrow escape, every moment when something had worked, even briefly, even partially, against something stronger, The veil theory had never banned this tradition because they had never understood what it was. One person remembering old stories. What possible threat could that be? The current rememberer's name was Seraph. She was 300 years old, middle-aged by Korathi standards, and she lived in an enclosed habitat on the dark side of El Shera that was registered in Dominion administrative records as a cultural preservation unit. It was, in fact, a bunker, and in that bunker, Seraph had something she had built over the course of 40 years from components collected so slowly and so carefully that no single acquisition had ever triggered a Dominion monitoring flag. An illegal receiver. She had built it not knowing what she was waiting to hear, just knowing that she was waiting. That something in the accumulated weight of 300 years of her species' history. Every story of every person who had watched the sky and felt that particular helplessness told her that the waiting mattered, that one day something would come to the dark worth listening to. And then an old man in Iceland started reading poetry. Seraph had no Icelandic, no English, no human language of any kind. It didn't matter. The voice came through her receiver cracked and warm and completely unafraid, and something the tone of it, the rhythm, the weight, the specific texture of a human being choosing beauty over silence in the last hours before the end of everything, bypassed every linguistic barrier as cleanly as a knife through water. She sat in her bunker on the dark side of a planet 300 light years from Earth, and she listened to Gunnar Sigurdsson read poetry he had been saving his whole life, and she felt something move through her that she had not felt in a very long time. Not rage, not hope, not even grief. Exactly. Recognition. The specific, chest-tightening recognition of seeing something in someone else that you thought had died in yourself. A mirror held up across impossible distance, showing you an image of who you were before you learned to be small. She stayed at the receiver for 6 hours. When it went quiet, she sat in the dark for a long time. Then she started building something she had never built before. A network. She was not the only one watching. This is the thing that needs to be understood. The thing that changes everything about what came next. The Veil Theory Dominion contained over 200 distinct species. Every single one of them had a moment in their history that looked like humanity's current moment. Every single one of them had felt those ships in their sky, had done that math, had reached that same terrible junction where compliance and extinction felt like two paths to the same destination, just at different speeds. Most of them had complied, and in complying, they had learned to shrink, to fold themselves into shapes that didn't alarm the Empire, to teach their children not what they were, but what they were permitted to be, generation after generation of managed diminishment, until the original shape of a species. Its ambition, its anger, its irrational stubborn insistence on existing on its own terms became something that only existed in the stories told by the people whose job it was to remember. But the stories survived. They always survived. Because of Veil Theory, for all their 11,000 years and their compendium and their perfect rational models of how species behaved, had never fully grasped the one truth that every single human child learns before they can read, that you cannot confiscate a story. The Drevathi were, in the past tense, a warrior species. 50 years ago, they had fought the Veil Theory in an actual declared war. Real ships, real weapons, real tactical doctrine developed over centuries of their own military history. They had technology that exceeded humanity's current capabilities, had exceeded it significantly, and a will to fight that was not philosophical or spiritual, but cellular, biological, written into the structure of their bodies the way migration is written into birds. They lasted 4 months. The Veil Theory had broken them with a specific, deliberate, almost surgical efficiency that went beyond military defeat. Their fleet was dismantled, their weapons confiscated, their military leadership, whoever survived the war itself, was publicly reassigned to administrative roles. Clerks, record keepers, processors of forms. The message was not subtle. You were warriors. Now you are bookkeepers. This is what you are. Adjust. And in 50 years, they had adjusted. Most of them. Commander Veth was 80 years old and officially retired and listed in Dominion records as fully compliant and no threat. He had spent 50 years being no threat. He had watched his species fold itself into the shape the Empire required, watched the young ones grow up not knowing what their grandparents had been, watched the word warrior become something historical and slightly embarrassing, like a family story about an ancestor who made a scene at a party. He had a receiver, too. He had built it differently than Saratha's. Cruder, more powerful, with a wider range and considerably less concern for avoiding detection. Because at 80 years old, Veth had reached a particular piece of a person who has decided that certain risks are worth taking. He watched the footage of humanity's first battle 3 times. The 11-minute engagement, the 3 strike cells, the Veil Theory interceptor drones responding with the casual efficiency of something that has never once had to take an enemy seriously. He watched Cell 4 go dark. He watched Tomas Reyes fly his broken fighter directly at a drone at 280 meters, then 260, then pull out at the last possible moment with 17 photographs and a confirmed blind spot. He watched it 3 times. Then he sat very still for a long time. Then he said something out loud in his own language in an empty room on a planet 300 light years from Earth that he had not said in 50 years. He said, "They know they've lost, and they're still fighting." A pause. We knew we'd lost too. Why did we stop? If you feel something shifting right now, if that question just landed somewhere deep, comment, remember below, because this isn't just one old soldier asking one question. This is an entire galaxy asking it at the same time. Saratha's network was not impressive by any technical standard. 14 planets, 14 illegal receivers, all manually operated, all dependent on timing windows so narrow that a 60-second delay could cause a complete communication failure, all running on hardware that any Veil Theory Systems analyst would have dismissed as primitive with the same casual contempt they applied to everything that wasn't their own. But it worked, and through it, Sarah began doing something that no human soldier, no human general, not even Yaravos was doing. She began compiling history. Specifically, the military history of every species in the Dominion that had ever fought the Veil Theory, every strategy that had been tried, every mistake that had been made, every approach that had come close, that had almost worked, that had needed just a little more time or a little more information or one slightly different decision. She cross-referenced, annotated, connected patterns across species and centuries that no single species could have connected on their own because no single species had access to all the pieces. A blind spot discovered by one species 300 years ago, a response pattern weakness identified by another 200 years ago, a drone coverage gap confirmed by a third, the same gap from a different angle 150 years ago, the same blind spot. 3 different species, 3 different centuries, 3 separate discoveries of the same vulnerability in Veil Theory drone architecture, all of it sitting in the Veil Theory's own records, all of it classified by their own algorithms as irrelevant tactical noise from primitive adversaries, all of it pointing at the same thing, and all of it now moving carefully and illegally and at the speed of light toward a small, cold, technically insignificant planet in an unremarkable star system that had somehow, inexplicably, looked at the most powerful empire in the galaxy and said no. Preet Soni came into Yara's command post at 2 a.m. holding a tablet and wearing the expression of someone who had just had something very large land on them from a great height. She looked up from the drone schematics she had been studying for 6 hours. "What?" "Transmission," he said. "Encrypted. Unknown frequency. Origin point based on signal degradation. It's not from Earth." The room got very quiet. Content. He slid the tablet across the table. Yara picked it up, started reading. It was battle logs. Detailed, annotated, cross-referenced battle logs from species she had never heard of, covering engagement against a Veil Theory that stretched back centuries. Strategies. Outcomes. Specific technical data on Veil Theory response patterns, weapon ranges, sensor coverage, tactical doctrine tendencies. And buried inside it, in a section that made Yara's hand go completely still on the tablet, a blind spot, documented, confirmed, coordinates and measurements and approach vectors. The same blind spot Tomas Reyes had confirmed with his body at 260 meters, but found first, 3 centuries ago, by a species that no longer existed as anything except a footnote in a Dominion administrative record. They had found it, and the Veil Theory had seen the data and filed it as irrelevant for 300 years. Yara set the tablet down. How many sources? At least 7 distinct species contributing data, Preet said. Maybe more. The compilation it's sophisticated. Commander, someone spent a long time on this. Someone is still spending time on this, she said. This isn't archival. Some of these annotations are recent. Someone out there is actively building this. But why send it to us? Yara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the tablet, at the blind spot, at 3 centuries of data that the Veil Theory had been carrying in their own records without ever understanding what it meant. Because we're doing something none of them did, she said, which is... She looked up. We didn't stop. The weight of that landed in the room and stayed there because it was true, and because it was true in a way that went beyond military strategy or tactical calculation. It was true in a way that the most important things are always true, simply, completely, without needing explanation. Humanity had not stopped. 6 people were dark. The Veil Theory assessment fleet still sat in orbit like a bad promise. Something called Phase 2 had been authorized and was coming from somewhere between the stars. By every rational metric, every cost-benefit analysis, every logical projection of where this was going, humanity should have stopped. And somewhere in the galaxy, on 14 planets, in 14 bunkers and hidden rooms and carefully constructed illegal listening posts, species that had stopped were watching a species that hadn't, and remembering what it felt like, not the feeling of winning. None of them had felt that in a very long time. The feeling just before winning becomes possible. The feeling of deciding that the math doesn't get the final vote. That night, Yara Voss wrote something in her briefing notebook that she had never written before. Not in 14 months in a cell. Not in 3 years of building a doctrine that nobody wanted to hear. Not in 6 weeks of watching humanity quietly, carefully, at enormous cost begin to become the thing she had always believed it could be. She wrote 2 words, not alone, and underneath them, in smaller writing, the thought that followed immediately, the thought she didn't let herself feel fully, because feeling it fully would cost her focus she couldn't afford to lose right now, but that she also could not write down because some things are too true to leave unrecorded. We are going to need them. Because Phase 2 had been authorized, and what was coming was not more of what had already come. The 61 assessment ships were scouts. That was all they had ever been. What was coming now had a name in Veil Theory military language that translated, imperfectly but close enough, as the Anvil. In 11,000 years of Dominion expansion, the Anvil had been deployed exactly once. The planet it had been deployed against no longer existed, not conquered, not subjugated, gone, erased from the star charts as cleanly as a word removed from a sentence. And it was coming here. It was coming for humanity. And Yara Voss, sitting in an underground command post in Finland with a tablet full of 3 centuries of other species' pain and a notebook with 2 words written in it, was the only person on Earth who knew that the 11 minutes of the first battle, the blood and the photographs and the 6 people who went dark so that a blind spot could be confirmed, had bought them something more valuable than any weapon. It had bought them time. Not much, but enough. Maybe there's a moment before a trap closes when everything is still. Not the stillness of peace. Not the stillness of safety. The stillness of a held breath. The stillness of 1,000 moving parts that have been set in motion by months of planning and sacrifice and sleepless calculation, all of them now beyond a point of recall. All of them committed. All of them depend on every other part doing exactly what was built to do at exactly the right moment. Yara Voss had lived in that stillness for 6 weeks. Today it was going to end, one way or another. Nova Station was not impressive. That was the point. It had been in a previous life, a mid-range orbital refueling depot sitting at the gravitational midpoint between Earth and the Moon, the kind of infrastructure that nobody thought about until they needed it, which meant nobody thought about it most of the time. It had a skeleton crew of 40, a fuel processing capacity that serviced maybe 200 vessels a year, and the aesthetic appeal of a very large, very functional metal box suspended in the dark. The Veil Theory assessment fleet had scanned it on day 1 of their arrival. Their analysis, non-military installation, no weapons detected, no strategic value, no threat. They were right about all 3. What their scan had not detected, because it had not existed yet when they scanned it, was what humanity had spent the last 10 weeks quietly, carefully, and at staggering human cost building inside it. Not a weapon, a mouth. The plan had 3 layers. Yara had explained this to her 17 cell commanders in a briefing that lasted 4 hours, and left most of them staring at the wall afterward with a particular expression of people who have just been told something that is simultaneously brilliant and deeply, profoundly terrible. The first layer was the invitation. Humanity needed the veil theory to move. The assessment fleet had been holding position for weeks, watching, scanning, cataloging, feeding data back to whatever Dominion command structure was processing humanity's continued defiance as an interesting but manageable anomaly. They were not attacking. They were not retreating. They were doing the thing that had worked against every other species they had ever assessed, waiting for the prey to exhaust itself. The invitation needed to make them move without making them suspicious. It needed to look like desperation. It needed to look like humanity had found something, some weapon, some technology, some last card being played, and was concentrating its forces at Nova Station for a final stand. Ghost architecture handled this. Over the course of 5 days, every false signal, every decoy transmission, every carefully fabricated piece of military communication that humanity's intelligence team had been broadcasting for months was redirected to point toward one location, Nova Station. The signal suggested humanity was moving something there, something significant, something the veil theory's cultural analysis algorithms would classify as a final defensive gambit, the kind of concentrated, desperate, all-in tactical move that their compendium had an entire category for. Entry category, terminal resource consolidation, probability of success, negligible, recommended response, single capital ship engagement. They took the bait. The second layer was the teeth. Yara had a problem. Humanity had no weapons capable of meaningfully damaging a veil theory capital ship. This was not a gap in their arsenal. This was a chasm, the kind of technological distance that couldn't be bridged in 10 weeks regardless of how many sleepless engineers you threw at it. So she didn't try to bridge it. She went around it. The data package from Saratha's network had contained, buried in 3 centuries of accumulated intelligence, something that no human physicist had ever had access to before, a detailed profile of how veil theory faster-than-light drives worked. Not how to build one, not how to replicate one, but how they behave in the moments immediately after a transit jump, the specific, brief, unavoidable window during which a ship emerging from FDL was cycling its drive for re-engagement. 6.3 seconds. That was the window. 6.3 seconds during which a veil theory capital ship's primary propulsion was offline. Its defensive screens were cycling, and its sensor arrays were recalibrating from jump transit. 6.3 seconds in which a veil theory capital ship was, in the most precise technical sense of the word, vulnerable, not destroyable, not even significantly damageable by anything humanity currently possessed, but vulnerable to one specific thing: location. If you knew exactly where a ship was going to emerge from FDL, within a margin of error tight enough to matter, and if you had something positioned at that exact location, waiting for that 6.3-second window, you couldn't destroy the ship, but you could blind it. Yara had given the engineering problem to a team of 7 people and told them they had 3 weeks. They came back in 16 days. What they built was not elegant. It was not the kind of technology that would be written about in textbooks or displayed in museums. It was, in the plainest possible terms, the most powerful directed electromagnetic pulse device that human engineering had ever produced, built from components cannibalized from every satellite, every orbital platform, every piece of space-based infrastructure that humanity had launched in 40 years of space development. It had one function. In a 6.3-second window, pointed at the right location, it would emit a pulse powerful enough to fry every external sensor array on a veil theory capital ship for approximately 4 hours. 4 hours of blindness. Not destroyed, not disabled, just blind, in the context of an 11,000-year-old empire with technology so advanced it could switch off orbital defense platforms like a light switch. 4 hours of blindness sounded like almost nothing. In the context of Yara's plan, it was everything. Pause here for just a moment, because if this plan is starting to feel like it might actually work, if some part of you is leaning forward right now, comment NOVA below. We're about to get to the part that costs the most. And you need to be ready for it. The third layer was the price. Yara had not hidden it from her commanders. She had not softened it, not framed it in the kind of careful strategic language that made necessary horror sound like acceptable calculation. She had put it in plain words in a plain room and let it sit in the air and waited for her commanders to decide if they were still in. They were all still in. This was the third layer. Nova Station needed to be crewed, not by automated systems, not by remote operation. The EMP device required manual calibration in the 6.3-second window, a process so precise, so dependent on real-time human judgment responding to conditions that could not be fully predicted, that no automated system could reliably execute it. A human hand had to be on the trigger. At Nova Station, when the Veil Theory ship arrived, and the Veil Theory, responding to what they believed was a terminal resource consolidation, would not send one ship, based on their response patterns from the first battle, based on 3 centuries of data from Saratha's network, based on every piece of intelligence humanity had gathered in 10 weeks of bleeding for information. Yara's model projected they would send 3 capital ships. 3 capital ships to deal with what they believed was humanity's last desperate stand. 3 capital ships that would emerge from FDL at a predictable location within a predictable window and find Nova Station waiting. The crew of Nova Station would have one job: blind them, all 3, in a combined window of approximately 19 seconds, after which the Veil Theory ships, blind but fully functional in every other capacity, would almost certainly destroy Nova Station. Yara had been very clear about that part. The commander of Nova Station's final crew was a woman named Dr. Petra Solano. She was not a soldier. She was a physicist, 41 years old. She had spent 17 years studying the theoretical properties of electromagnetic pulse propagation in zero-gravity environments, which made her the single most qualified human being alive to operate the device her team had built. She had 2 children, a daughter named Mira, 9 years old, a son named Dario, 6. She had recorded a message for them before she boarded. She did not tell them where she was going. She did not tell them what she was doing. She told them about the first time she had looked through a telescope as a child and seen Jupiter's moons. She told them about how it had felt, that specific feeling of a universe suddenly being larger and more full of things worth knowing than she had previously understood. She told them that this feeling was the most important thing that had ever happened to her, and that she hoped they would feel it too, and that everything she had ever done had been in some way about making sure the universe stayed the kind of place where a child could look through a telescope and feel that. She told them she loved them in 3 different ways. Then she boarded. There were 31 people with her. 31 people who had each said their version of what Petra said. 31 people who understood, with complete clarity, what Layer 3 of the plan required. The Veil Theory response to Nova Station's invitation came 18 hours after Ghost Architecture redirected the signals. 3 capital ships emerged from FDL at the projected coordinates. The timing matched Yara's models to within 0.4 seconds. In the underground command post in Finland, Yara watched the sensor feeds with her hands flat on the table and her breathing controlled and her face doing nothing that anyone watching would have been able to read. Preet stood beside her. He was not controlling his face. There at the coordinates, the analyst at the sensor board reported, all 3, FDL drive cycling, window opening in... I know, Yara said. 6.3 seconds. Petra Solano's hands were steady. This surprised her distantly in the part of her brain that was still capable of being surprised. She had expected shaking. She had expected the biological reality of fear to express itself in her hands, in her breathing, in some physical manifestation of what her body understood was happening even when her mind had made its peace with it. Her hands were steady. The first ship emerged. The window opened. She fired, and that was the moment everything changed. The pulse hit the first capital ship's sensor arrays at the 4-second mark of its transit window. Every external sensor on a vessel the size of a city, dark. The second ship emerged 11 seconds later. Petra's hands moved, calibrated, adjusted for the drift that her models had predicted, and her hands had practiced for 10 days without stopping. She fired again. Dark. The third ship. 18 seconds total. She fired. Dark. In the Veil Theory command structure of all three vessels, alarms that had not sounded in 11,000 years of warfare began to sound. Not the alarms of damage, not the alarms of weapons fire or hull breach or drive failure, the alarms of something that their threat assessment protocols had never assigned a serious probability to. Surprise. In the underground command post, the analyst's voice broke slightly on the words. All three targets. Sensor arrays confirmed offline. Commander, it worked. All three. Nova station status, Yara said. A pause. Longer than it should have been. Nova station is... Another pause. Yara closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Nova station is dark, the analyst said. The room was very quiet. 32 people. Dark. The word that didn't bleed the way other words bled. 32 bricks in a wall that the enemy still didn't know was being built. Preet made a sound beside her. Small. Controlled. The sound of someone holding something very heavy. Yara opened her eyes. What is the Veil Theory fleet doing? They're holding position. All three ships are holding. No aggressive maneuvers. They appear to be assessing. How long until their arrays come back online? Our models say 4 hours. Give or take 20 minutes. Then we have 4 hours, Yara said. Her voice was the same. Controlled. Precise. The voice of someone who had decided a long time ago that the way you honor people who paid a price was by making sure the thing they bought with that price was used well. She looked at the sensor display. 3 blind capital ships. 3 ships that were, for the next 4 hours, unable to see what was happening around them. 3 ships that could not watch, could not observe, could not feed intelligence back to the Dominion High Command that had sent them. Begin Phase 4, she said. Phase 4 was not a battle. It was a message. In the 4 hours that the Veil Theory ship sat blind, humanity did something that no species in Compendium had ever done to Dominion in 11,000 years of warfare. It transmitted directly to them. Not a surrender, not a threat, not a demand. A record. Every piece of data from every cell engagement, every battle log, every annotated photograph from Tomas Reyes, every piece of intelligence from Seratha's network. 3 centuries of other species' pain and courage and desperate resistance, all of it compiled and organized and transmitted directly into the data cores of 3 blind Veil Theory capital ships in a format specifically designed to be impossible to ignore. The message that accompanied it was written by Yara and edited exactly once. It said, "You have been here for 10 weeks. In 10 weeks, you have seen us bleed. You have watched us lose people and keep moving. You have watched a species that should, by every rational calculation, have surrendered, not surrender. You have watched us find your blind spots, accept your costs, adapt to your tactics, and build something you have no entry for in your compendium. We are not asking you to leave. We are telling you something your 11,000 years of victory have never required you to know. We are expensive, and the anvil that you have sent for us, whatever it costs to turn around, whatever administrative inconvenience it creates, whatever it does to the Dominion's expansion timeline, it will cost less than what finishing this will cost you. We have 32 new reasons to continue. We will always have more reasons. That is what we are. Consider your options carefully." The 4 hours passed. The Veil Theory sensor arrays came back online. The 3 capital ships held position for 11 more hours without moving, without transmitting, without any observable action. In the underground command post, nobody slept. Then, at hour 15, one of the 3 ships moved. Not toward Earth, away from it. Then the second, then the third. 3 Veil Theory capital ships, turning away from a planet they had come to observe and transitioning to FTL, back toward whatever part of the Dominion they had come from, carrying in their data cores a transmission that no algorithm was going to classify as irrelevant. Not this time. Preet was crying. He wasn't trying to hide it. The analyst at the sensor board made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely. Yara watched the ships disappear from display one by one. She did not cry. She would cry later, when the wall was finished, when there was time, when 32 names could be said out loud in a room without the saying of them costing something she couldn't afford to spend. For now, she looked at the empty display where 3 ships had been, and she allowed herself one thing, one small, precise, carefully rationed thing. She allowed herself to believe that this was not the end. But the celebration, if the quiet, exhausted, grief-weighted silence in that room could be called a celebration, lasted exactly 4 hours. Because at hour 4, a new signal appeared on the long-range sensor array. Not 3 ships, not 61. Something that the sensor array spent 47 seconds trying to classify before it returned a result that made the analysts go completely silent at their station. "Commander," the analyst said. Their voice was wrong. The specific wrongness of someone reading a number that their brain is refusing to accept as real. "I see it," Yara said. She had seen it. She had been watching it since the second. The anvil was not a ship. It was not a fleet. It was a structure, mobile, ancient, so large that the sensor array had initially classified it as a dwarf planet before the drive signatures registered. And it was not coming at the speed of an invasion. It was coming at the speed of something that has never needed to hurry. Something that has arrived at every destination and has ever been sent to and done what it was sent to do without exception, without deviation, without any recorded instance of encountering a problem it could not solve. "How long until it reaches us?" Yara asked. The analyst ran the calculation twice. 18 days, they said. 18 days. Yara looked at the display. 32 people dark. 3 ships turned away. 1 victory, real and earned and paid for in full. And 18 days. She picked up her notebook. She opened it to the page where she had written "not alone." She looked at it for a long moment. Then she turned to a new page and started writing. Because 18 days was not enough time for most things. But Yara Voss had never needed most things. She needed one thing, and she had exactly 18 days to find it. The news broke before Yara could contain it. Not through any leak. Not through carelessness or a compromised cell or a veil theory intelligence operation. It broke the way the most important things always break. Organically, unstoppably, through the simple human inability to witness something extraordinary and stay quiet about it. Someone at a ground-based sensor station in New Zealand had watched 3 Veil Theory capital ships turn around and leave, and they had told someone, who told someone, who told someone. And within 6 hours, every person on Earth knew that humanity had done something that had never been done in 11,000 years of Veil Theory expansion history. It had made them blink. The reaction was not what Yara expected. She had anticipated relief. She had anticipated the specific, fragile, cautious optimism of people who had been holding their breath for 10 weeks and had been given permission to exhale. She had anticipated tears and celebrations, and the kind of collective emotional release that comes when a pressure that has been building longer than it can be consciously measured finally finds an outlet. What she did not anticipate was the anger. It came from everywhere at once. From the families of the 6 people lost in the first battle. From the communities surrounding the 3 cities that had been sitting under the shadow of Veil Theory ships since day 1. From soldiers in cells who had spent 10 weeks training and waiting and carrying the specific weight of people who have been told to be patient while the cost of patience is paid in other people's lives. The anger said, "We won something, and we lost 38 people winning it, and nobody told us, and nobody asked us, and the person who made those decisions is in a bunker in Finland and has not said a single word to the people who are actually living under these ships." The anger was not wrong. Yara knew it was not wrong. She had made a choice, the same choice she would make again, had to make, could not have made differently. To keep the cells isolated, to keep the plan compartmentalized, to treat information as a weapon to be rationed rather than a right to be shared. It was a correct tactical decision. It had kept the plan intact. It had kept the Veil Theory from being able to extract the full picture from any single captured cell. It was also the decision of someone who had spent 14 months in a cell thinking about war and not about the people who had to live inside it. She had not been wrong about the strategy. She had not been fully right about everything else. Secretary General Nwolfer called her at hour 7. The call lasted 40 minutes. Yara spoke for approximately 4 of them. She spent the other 36 listening. Nwolfer was not cruel. She was not unfair. She was precise in a way that very good leaders are precise. She identified the specific nature of the problem without exaggerating it and without minimizing it, and she told Yara what needed to happen next with the directness of someone who understood that they had 18 days and could not afford the luxury of conversation that lasted longer than necessary. They need to see you, Nwolfer said. Not a statement. Not a briefing document. You, on camera, saying their names. A pause. 32 names, Yara said. 38, Nwolfer said quietly. The 6 from the first battle, too. Yara was silent for a moment. I know all 38, she said. I know you do, Nwolfer said. That's why it has to be you. The broadcast went out at 9 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. No script, no teleprompter, no carefully prepared remarks filtered through a communications team. Yara sat in front of a camera in a room that was clearly underground, clearly functional, clearly not designed for broadcast. Bare concrete walls, a single work light, the edge of a tactical display visible in background. And she said 38 names. She said them slowly. She said them completely. First name, last name, where they were from, what they did before the war. One specific thing about each of them that she knew because she read every file and memorized every detail, because she believed that the people who paid for something with their lives deserved to be known by the person who asked them to pay it. It took 22 minutes. When she finished, she did not pivot immediately to strategy. She did not transition into a speech about sacrifice and necessity and the greater good. She sat with the names for a moment, just sat with them. Then she looked at the camera and she said, I made decisions that cost people their lives. I will make more decisions that cost more people their lives. I cannot promise you that the people you love will be safe. I cannot promise you that the math of what we are doing will always feel like the right math when it is your person who becomes a number. What I can promise you is this. I know every name. I will always know every name. And every decision I make will be made by someone who knows every name. We have 18 days. And I need everyone, to be ready to do something that has never been done before. Not by humans. Not by anyone. I'll explain everything. All of it. No more compartments. You deserve to know what you're fighting for. And you deserve to choose it. If that just hit you, some of you weren't expecting, comment 38 names below, because what happened after that broadcast is the part of the story that changes everything. The response to the broadcast came in 3 forms. The first was human. Within 2 hours of the broadcast, Yara's command post received over 400 million individual messages. Not form responses, not automated replies. Personal messages from people on every continent, in every language, many of them barely coherent with emotion, many of them saying some version of the same thing. Tell me what to do. Not tell me it will be okay. Not tell me we will win. Not comfort or reassurance, or the kind of language that asks nothing in return. Tell me what to do. Yara read 200 of them personally before Preet gently removed the tablet from her hands at 3 a.m. and told her that she needed 4 hours of sleep or she was going to start making mistakes. She read 40 more before she slept. The second response was unexpected. At hour 11 after broadcast, Saratha's network transmitted again. It was not data this time. Not battle logs or technical specifications or compiled intelligence from 3 centuries of resistance history. It was a message, direct, personal, in a language that the translation algorithm struggled with for 6 hours before producing something that everyone who read it agreed was approximately right, but probably missed something in the texture of it. It said, we heard you say the names. On our world, we also say names. We have many names. We have been saying them for a long time with no one listening. We are listening now. We want you to know. You're not the only ones who have lost people to this thing. You are the only ones who kept moving after. Tell us how to help. We will do what we can from where we are. It is not much, but it is not nothing. Nothing is what we had before you said no. Yara read it 4 times. Then she wrote back. She wrote back for the first time in the history of humanity's contact with Saratha's network, breaking the one-way nature of the communication that had characterized everything up to this point, taking the risk that the transmission could be detected, accepting that risk because some things are worth the cost. She wrote, we hear your names too. Tell us what you know about the anvil. Everything. We have 18 days. The response came back in 40 minutes. It was long. It was detailed. And it contained something that made Yara sit very still for a very long time. The anvil had a weakness, not a vulnerability in the conventional sense, not a blind spot or a coverage gap or a 6.3-second window during FDL transition. Nothing so clean or so actionable. It was more fundamental than that. It was philosophical. The anvil was not a weapon in the way that a gun is a weapon or a missile is a weapon. A thing built for a specific destructive purpose, operated by someone who points it and fires it and accepts the outcome. The anvil was a system, an ancient, automated, self-contained system that had been built 11,000 years ago by the founders of the Veil-Theory Dominion for one specific purpose: the permanent, total, irreversible elimination of a civilization that the Dominion had determined was too costly to subjugate. It did not respond to military attack. It was not operated by a crew that could be killed or captured. It did not have a commander who could be reasoned with or a chain of command that could be disrupted. It responded to one input and one input only: a designation signal from Dominion High Command confirming that the target civilization met the criteria for elimination. Remove the signal, or more precisely, introduce enough ambiguity into the Dominion High Command's assessment of whether humanity met those criteria, and the Anvil's targeting system would enter a hold state, not indefinitely, but for long enough. Saratha's network had pulled this from the records of a species called the Mephirai, a civilization that had, 2,000 years ago, come closer to stopping the Anvil than anyone before or since. They had not discovered the weakness in time to use it, but they had documented it, carefully, completely, in the hope that someone, someday, would find it. And here it was, in Yara's hands. 18 days. The criteria for elimination were specific. The Veil-Theory Dominion did not deploy the Anvil casually. Even by their standards, it was a significant administrative and energetic commitment. The designation required a formal assessment confirming three things. First, the target civilization posed an irreconcilable resistance to integration. Second, the cost of continued military engagement exceeded the value of the system's resources. Third, the target civilization had no significant value to the broader galactic community that would make its elimination politically costly. Criteria 1. Humanity had satisfied enthusiastically. Criteria 2. The three ships turning away from Earth had introduced doubt. Not enough doubt, but some. Criteria 3. That was the door. Yara looked at Preet. Preet looked at the analysis on the screen. "We need to make the galaxy care whether we live," he said. "Yes. In 18 days. 17 now." He was quiet for a moment. "How?" Yara turned to the data package from Saratha's network, to the 14 planets, to the 7 species who have been quietly, illegally, at enormous personal risk, feeding humanity information for months, to Saratha herself, 300 years old, a bunker on the dark side of the planet, a receiver built from 40 years of carefully collected scraps, a tradition of remembering that the Veil Theory had never bothered to suppress because they had never understood what it was, to Commander Veth, 80 years old, a warrior species that had been turned into bookkeepers, 50 years of adjusted expectations and managed diminishment, and one old man who had watched 11 minutes of footage and asked a question he hadn't asked in half a century. "Why did we stop?" "We don't make the galaxy care," Yara said. "Then what?" "We remind it that it already does." The plan that emerged from the next 14 hours of continuous work was not elegant. Elegance, Yara had long since decided, was a luxury of people who had enough time to refine things. What she had instead was 16 days, and a team of people who had not slept properly in weeks, and a problem that required doing something that no species under Dominion control had done in 11,000 years. Organizing. Not humanity organizing. Humanity was already organized. 400 cells, a global communication network, a population that had watched a 22-minute broadcast and responded with 400 million messages that all said the same thing. Tell me what to do. The galaxy organizing. 14 planets. 7 species. An illegal network built from 40 years of carefully collected scrap and maintained by people who had every reason to stay silent and had chosen not to. Yara needed them to stop being silent. Not militarily. Not with weapons or ships or any kind of direct confrontation with the Dominion that would get them killed before it accomplished anything. She needed them to be visible. Specifically, She needed them to transmit, openly, on frequencies the veil theory monitored, not military communications. Nothing that would trigger a threat response. Cultural transmissions. The kind of thing that Dominion monitoring algorithms would process and classify and file under non-threatening autonomous cultural activity. She needed them to transmit about humanity, about what they had watched, about what it had meant to them, about the names they had been saying in the dark for centuries, and the feeling of having someone finally say names back. She needed them to make it impossible for the Dominion's assessment of Criteria 3 to come back as no significant value to the broader galactic community. Because if 14 species, even small ones, even conquered ones, even species that the Dominion had filed under Grade 4 dependent and not thought about since, if 14 species simultaneously demonstrated that humanity's existence had changed something in them, meant something to them, had reached across hundreds of light years and reminded them of something the Empire had spent centuries trying to make them forget, then humanity was not without value to the galactic community. And the anvil would pause. Long enough. She transmitted the request to Saratha's network on day 16. She was asking them to take a risk that she had no right to ask them to take. She was asking species that had spent decades or centuries carefully, painstakingly maintaining the level of invisibility that kept them alive to become visible, to break a silence that had been their only protection, on behalf of the species they had never met, for a plan that might not work, with consequences that could be devastating if it went wrong. She put all of that in the message. She did not minimize it, did not soften it, did not wrap in the kind of language that makes an impossible ask sound like a reasonable request. She said, "This is what we need. This is what it will cost you. This is why we are asking. You know us well enough now to know that we do not ask lightly. You know yourselves well enough to know what this means. We cannot make this decision for you. We would not want to make it freely or not at all." She sent it. Then she waited. The first response came from Sarath. For words. We remember. We transmit. The second came from Veth. 3 words. In Drevathi, which the translation algorithm rendered as, "Warriors remember how." Then the third, the fourth, the fifth, by hour 6. 11 of the 14 network nodes had responded. By hour 12, all 14 had. And then something happened that Yara had not planned for, something that no algorithm had predicted, that no model had accounted for, that existed in no strategic framework, because it had never happened before, and therefore no one had known to include it in any calculation. Species that were not part of Saratha's network began transmitting. Species that had been listening to the network's illegal frequencies without anyone knowing. Species that had heard humanity's broadcast through their own illegal receivers. Devices built the same way Sarath had built hers, from the same kind of 40-year accumulation of carefully collected scraps, maintained by the same kind of quietly stubborn people who had decided that staying connected to something real was worth the risk. 17 species, then 23, then 31. All of them transmitting on open frequencies about a planet they had never visited, a species they had never met, a war they could not fight in, and all of them saying, in 31 different languages, in 31 different cultural vocabularies, the same essential thing. This one matters. This one is worth something. Do not erase this one. The Veil Theory Dominion's monitoring algorithms process the transmissions. All of them. The Cultural Analysis Division filed a report to Dominion High Command that was, by Veil Theory administrative standards, extremely unusual. It was long. The standard length for a cultural analysis report on a Grade 4 dependent species was 3 lines. This report was 47 pages. It concluded with a recommendation that the Dominion had not issued in 11,000 years. Recommend temporary hold on elimination protocol pending reassessment of Criteria 3. The Anvil, 16 days out from Earth, received a hold signal from Dominion High Command. It entered a hold state. On Earth, nobody knew this yet. In a bunker in Finland, Yara Voss was sitting with her notebook open to the page where she had written the plan, all of it now, the full shape of it visible for first time now that it had been executed. And she was reading it back to herself, not to check it, not to revise it, just to see if it was real. Preet came in at hour 18. He had a look on his face that she had not seen before. Not relief, not triumph, Something quieter than both of those. Something that didn't have a clean strategic classification. The Anvil's drive signature, he said. It's changed. Long-range sensors are showing. It's not decelerating toward us. Commander, it's holding. It stopped moving. The room was very quiet. For how long? Yara asked. Unknown, but it's not moving. She looked at her notebook. 31 species transmitting about humanity on open frequencies. 38 names said out loud in a bare concrete room by a woman who knew all of them. 400 million messages that all said the same thing. A blind spot confirmed at 260 meters by a 23-year-old with steady hands. 6.3 seconds. 11 minutes. 18 days. She closed the notebook. She looked at Preet and she said the thing that the plan had always been pointing toward. The thing that was not a conclusion but beginning. Not an ending, but the point at which the real work started. It's not over, she said. No, he agreed, but it paused. Yes. She nodded slowly. Then we have time to do the thing we haven't done yet. He waited. What's that? He asked. She stood up, picked up her book, walked to the door. Stop surviving, she said, and start deciding what we're going to be. Outside, for the first time in 18 days, someone had propped open the facility's emergency exit, not for tactical reasons, not for ventilation or protocol, or any of the 100 practical purposes. An emergency exit could serve, just to let in the night air, just to let someone stand in a doorway and look up at a sky that still had ships in it. Fewer now and uncertain, and for the first time not entirely sure themselves, and breathe. The stars were out. They had always been out, of course. They had been out every night of the war, every night of the occupation, every night of the 10 weeks in which humanity had bled and calculated and grieved and refused. But tonight they looked different, not safer, not closer, just different in the way that everything looks different when you have paid attention to it long enough to understand what you are actually looking at. Not a ceiling, a road, and somewhere 300 light years away, in a bunker on the dark side of a planet called Velshera, Sarah sat at her receiver and listened to 31 species say a name she had learned to pronounce 2 months ago. Human. And she said it back. And it felt, after 300 years of silence, like the beginning of a language. The delegation arrived on a Thursday, not with fire, not with the casual, contemptuous silence of first arrival, those 61 ships materializing in low orbit like a hand pressing down on something small, not with the cold, clinical transmission that had given humanity 72 hours to comply or be cleared. They arrived with one ship, a single vessel, smaller than any they had sent before, emerging from FDL at a respectful distance and broadcasting on every frequency humanity monitored a signal that the translation algorithms processed in 11 seconds and returned as something that made every analyst in every monitoring station on the planet sit up straight at the same moment. A request, not a demand, not an ultimatum, not a designation or a classification or a protocol number. A request. We wish to speak with the one who said the names. The debate about whether to respond lasted 4 hours. General Mays wanted conditions, verification protocols, a security framework. He wanted the meeting held in space, on neutral ground, with full military escort and every piece of recording equipment humanity possessed running continuously. 3 junior council members wanted to refuse entirely, arguing that any engagement was a trap, that the veil theory had 11,000 years of practice at diplomatic maneuvers and humanity had approximately 10 weeks of practice at not dying, and that sitting across a table from something that could erase your planet was not a negotiation, but a performance of one. They were not wrong about the asymmetry. Nwolfer listened to 4 hours of it. Then she asked one question. What is the alternative? The room went quiet, because the alternative was the Anvil sitting at a hold state of unknown duration, waiting for a reassessment that could go either way, while humanity spent its remaining time and remaining people on a military strategy that had, at its absolute best, on the most optimistic possible reading of everything that had happened, made the most powerful empire in the galaxy pause for a moment before deciding whether to erase them. A pause was not a victory. A pause was a breath. And you could not live inside a breath forever. Bring Yara, Nwolfer said. She came up from the bunker for the first time in 11 weeks. The light was wrong. That was the first thing she noticed. Not bad, just different from the work-like quality of underground fluorescence. Different in a way that required her eyes to adjust for longer than she expected. Different in a way that reminded her body that it had been a long time since she had stood in a place where the ceiling was not concrete. Preet drove her to the secure landing facility outside Oslo. They didn't talk much. At one point, passing through a small town that had inexplicably decorated its main street with handmade flags, not national flags, not military insignia, just hand-painted pieces of fabric in every color hung between buildings like the town had decided that this particular Thursday required marking somehow. Yara rolled down the window. She didn't say anything. She just looked at the flags for the 30 seconds they were visible. Then she rolled the window up. Preet, watching her from the driver's seat, said nothing. He understood what he was looking at. A person remembering what the thing they were fighting for actually looked like. The Veil Theory delegation consisted of 3 individuals. Yara had expected something imposing, something designed, consciously or not, to communicate physical superiority, technological superiority, the specific and comprehensive superiority of a civilization that had been doing this for 11,000 years and knew exactly how to walk into a room and make everything in it feel small. What she got was 3 beings who moved with particular care, people who understood they were in unfamiliar territory and were paying close attention. They were tall. That much was true. Bipedal, features that human neurology tried to map onto familiar categories and found unsatisfying analogies for. Eyes that process light differently. You could tell from the way they oriented toward the room's fixtures, and a quality of stillness that was not aggressive but was absolute. They did not fidget, did not shift weight, did not do any of the 1,000 small things that human bodies do when human minds are processing uncertainty. They were uncertain, though Yara could see it, not in their bodies, in the way they looked at her, the specific look of a species encountering something their models had told them they understood, and discovering in person that the models had been missing something. The lead delegate's name translated, approximately, as first voice of assessment. Yara called him first. He did not object. The meeting lasted 6 hours. No transcript was ever fully released. The full recording exists in 3 secured archives and has been seen by fewer than 40 people. What follows is what Yara wrote about it afterward, in her own words, in her notebook, in the same cramped handwriting that filled every margin of her battered copy of Sun Tzu. She wrote it in one sitting. The night after the meeting, without stopping, he asked me why we didn't stop. I had expected a different first question. I had prepared for a different first question. Capability assessments, territorial demands, the administrative language of a civilization that processes other civilizations the way a bureaucracy processes paperwork. I had a prepared answer for all of those. He asked me why we didn't stop. I said, because stopping was the same as ending, and we decided that ending was not acceptable. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, every species decide that. Every species we have ever encountered has decided that ending is not acceptable. And then the calculation changes. And they stop. I said, what calculation? He said, the calculation of what resistance costs against what resistance achieves. Every species reaches the point where the cost exceeds the achievable. And they stop. I said, we didn't do that calculation. He said, that is irrational. I said, yes. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I did not expect. He said, our analysts cannot model you. We have run your behavioral data through every predictive framework we possess. We can model your tactics. We can model your strategy. We can model your technology development curve and your resource allocation and your command structure. We cannot model. He used a word that the translators struggle with that came out as something between purpose and grief and the thing that remains after the reason is gone. We cannot model that. I looked at him. I said, that's because it's not a tactical variable. He said, then what is it? I thought about Gunnar Sigurdsson reading poetry while alien ships blocked out the sun. I thought about Tomas Reyes flying toward a drone at 260 meters with steady hands. I thought about Petra Solano recording a message about Jupiter's moons for 2 children who didn't know where she was going. I thought about 38 names. I thought about 31 species transmitting on open frequencies about a planet they had never visited. I thought about Seraph, 300 years old, in a bunker on the dark side of a planet, learning to say a word she had never said before. I said, "It's not a tactical variable. It's what we are made of." He said, "Explain." I said, "I can't. That's the point. If I could explain it, if it could be modeled, predicted, calculated, filed in a compendium and referenced in a threat assessment, it wouldn't be what it is. It would be a strategy. Strategies can be countered. What we are is not a strategy." He said, "Then what is it?" I said, "It's a thing that happens when you tell a species that they are not worth the cost of saving, and they decide, without any rational basis of the decision, that you are wrong." Long silence. He said, "That is a dangerous thing." I said, "Yes." He said, "You understand that we could still, that the anvil is still." I said, "I know." He said, "And that does not change your answer." I said, "It's not an answer. It's just what we are." He asked me, near the end, about the 31 species. He asked me how I had done it, how I had convinced species that had been compliant for decades or centuries to transmit openly on monitored frequencies on behalf of a civilization they had never met. I said, I didn't convince them. I asked them, and I told them the truth about what I was asking and what it would cost. And they decided. He said, "They decided to risk themselves for you." I said, "They decided to risk themselves for the idea that deciding matters, that the choice to resist or not resist should be a choice, not a calculation, not an inevitability. A choice." He was quiet. I said, "You spent 11,000 years making that choice feel impossible. You've been so comprehensively, so consistently, so completely victorious that the species under your control have forgotten that the choice exists. They comply not because they want to, but because compliance feels like the only option that is real." He said, "Compliance has kept them alive." I said, "Alive is not the same as living." He didn't answer that one. They broke for an hour at the 4-hour mark. Yara stood in a corridor outside the meeting room and drank bad coffee and looked at the wall. Preet found her there. He didn't ask how it was going. He could see how it was going in the quality of her stillness. Not the stillness of someone who is losing, but the stillness of someone who is doing the most important thing they have ever done and is aware of it with every part of themselves. He just stood next to her. After a while, she said, "He's not cruel." Preet waited. I thought he would be. Or indifferent, which is worse than cruel in some ways. But he's not. He's genuinely trying to understand something. He came here because something in the data from the last 11 weeks produced a result that his frameworks couldn't explain, and he needed to see it in person. "Is that good?" Preet asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "But it's real, and real is something to work with." She drank the rest of her coffee. He asked me about the names. She said, "What about them?" He wanted to know why I said them publicly, why I didn't just file them. He said, "In 11,000 years, they have never publicly acknowledged individual losses in a military engagement." He said it was inefficient, that it suggested emotional instability in command. "What did you say?" Yara almost smiled. I said that might be the most important thing I've told him today. Like this video, if you believe what Yara said next is one of the most important things any human being has ever said in any story you have ever heard, because we are about to get there, and it deserves to be earned. The final 2 hours of the meeting were different. Something had shifted in the room during the break. Not the balance of power. That was unchanged, would perhaps always be unchanged in the purely technical sense. The way the distance between a star and a planet doesn't change based on what the planet decides to do. But something else had shifted, the quality of attention in the room. First was no longer processing Yara. He was listening to her. There is a difference. Processing is what you do when you expect the input to confirm what you already know. Listening is what you do when you've accepted that the input might contain something you don't. He was listening. And Yara, who had been in enough rooms with enough people to know the difference between the two, felt it, and did the thing she always did when she found a door that had opened slightly. She walked through it. I asked him something I had not planned to ask. I asked him, "What do you want?" Not the Dominion, not the expansion protocol, not the administrative objectives of an empire processing a difficult acquisition. You, what do you want? He was still for a very long time. Then he said, I want to understand you. I said, why? He said, because in 11,000 years, nothing has behaved the way you behaved. And in 11,000 years, our models have been sufficient for everything, every species, every resistance, every last stand, every moment when something small looked up at something large and made a decision. He said, your decision produced an outcome our models assign a probability of less than 1%. I said, I know. He said, we need to understand why. And I said the thing I had been building toward for 6 hours. The thing that was not a tactical move or a strategic gambit or a carefully calculated position. The thing that was just true. I said, you will not understand it through analysis. He said, then how? I said, you will only understand it if you accept the possibility that there are things worth doing that cannot be justified by analysis. Things that exist outside the framework of cause and benefit and optimal outcomes. Things that are real and true and important precisely because they cannot be modeled. He said, that is a very inefficient way to exist. I said, yes, it is also the reason we are still here. Silence. I said, you came here with 11,000 years of victories. Every species you have encountered has eventually been fully explainable. Their behavior, their breaking points, their final calculations. You have a compendium. 413 entries now. Every futile act. Every last stand that didn't work. I said, I want to offer you entry 414. He said, we have not been defeated. I said, no, but you have been surprised. And in 11,000 years, that has never happened before. And the reason it happened is not our technology or our tactics or our strategy. Those were adequate. Barely. I said, the reason it happened is that we contain something your models cannot account for. Something we have always contained. Something we have used on ourselves, against ourselves, throughout our entire history, for better and for worse, in ways that have cost us enormously. He said, what is that? I said, the ability to decide that the story isn't over. Long silence. I said, not based on evidence, not based on calculation, not based on any rational assessment of the available information. I said, based on nothing more and nothing less than the decision that it isn't. I said, that is what I am made of. That is what we are made of, every one of us. The old man who read poetry, the pilot who flew at 260 meters, the physicist who kept her hands steady, the 31 species who remembered that they still had a choice. I said, you cannot model it because it is not a variable. It is a value. And the difference between a variable and a value is that a variable changes when conditions change, and a value does not. I said, our value does not change. I said, that is what you need to put in your compendium. The meeting ended at 11:47 p.m. No agreement was signed. No treaty. No terms. No formal cessation of hostilities or establishment of diplomatic relations or any of the clean, procedural markers by which civilizations usually demarcate the end of one thing and the beginning of another. First stood. His two colleagues stood. He looked at Yara for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something without lasting so long it became theatrical. He said one thing, we will reassess. And he left. Yara sat in the empty meeting room for a long time. Preet found her there an hour later. She was writing in her notebook. He sat down across from her and waited. After a while, she looked up. What happens now? He asked. She thought about it. Now, she said, we do the thing we should have been doing all along, in addition to everything else, which is, we become worth knowing. He waited for more. We have 31 species who stuck their necks out for us. We have 14 planets connected to a network built by a 300-year-old woman in a bunker who spent 40 years collecting scrap because she refused to stop listening. We have an empire that came here to erase us and is leaving to reassess because something in what we are does not fit in their models. She closed her notebook. That is not a victory, she said. A victory is when the threat is gone. The threat is not gone. The anvil is on hold, not recalled. The Dominion is reassessing, not withdrawing. We have earned a pause, a real one this time. long enough to mean something. Then what do we do with it? We build, she said. Not weapons, not defenses, not strategies. Then what? She looked at him. Relationships, she said. We go to those 14 planets. We learn those 31 languages. We sit with Seraph, and we listen to 300 years of names that she's been saying in the dark by herself. We find Veth, and we ask them what his people were before they were bookkeepers, and we help them remember. We become the kind of species that other species tell stories about. Not because we won, but because when we were losing, when every calculation said we should stop, we kept moving, and we reached back, and we said, "You are not alone." That's a strategy? Preet asked. Yara almost smiled. The warm version this time. The one that didn't have anything cold underneath it. It's not a strategy, she said. It's a value. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. Still had ships in it. Fewer than before. Uncertain, watching. Not yet gone, but no longer pressing down with the same casual, contemptuous weight. Somewhere between the stars, something the size of a dwarf planet sat in a hold state, waiting for a signal that had not yet come. Somewhere on a planet 300 light years away, a 300-year-old woman sat at an illegal receiver built from 40 years of scrap and listened to 31 species say a word she had learned 2 months ago. Somewhere an 80-year-old man who had not called himself a warrior in 50 years sat in an empty room and thought about what his people used to be and what they might still become. Somewhere a 9-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy were being raised by people who would one day tell them about their mother, about her steady hands, about the message she recorded, about Jupiter's moons and the feeling of the universe suddenly being larger than you thought. Somewhere 23 years old and steady-handed, Tomas Reyes was teaching someone else how to fly. And in a conference room in Oslo, a woman who had spent 14 months in a cell being right too early closed her notebook and looked at the lightening sky through a window and thought about what Sarah had said. Before you, we had nothing. After you, we had a word. Human. She thought about what that meant, what it should mean, what it would have to mean going forward. In every decision and every action, and every moment when the calculation said stop and the value said keep going. She thought about what it cost to be that word in the galaxy. What it would cost. What it already cost. 38 names. She knew them all. The galaxy did not change overnight. The Veil Fairy Dominion did not dissolve. The anvil was not recalled. The 200 species under Dominion control did not simultaneously rise up. The stars did not rearrange themselves into a more just configuration. None of the things that make for a clean and satisfying ending happened. What happened was smaller than that, and larger. What happened was that a species that had been 1 week away from erasure was still there, still talking, still building, still reaching across impossible distances to say to things that had never met, "You are not alone," still saying names, still refusing to let the calculation have the final word, still deciding without rational basis that the story was not over. It wasn't a victory. It was something better than a victory. It was a beginning, and somewhere in the Veil Fairy Dominion, in whatever passes the halls of the most powerful empire the galaxy has ever produced, an entry was being added to a compendium that had not been updated with anything genuinely new in 11,000 years. Entry 414. Species designation, human. Classification, unmodelable. Threat assessment, indefinite. Notes, they do not stop. Not because they cannot calculate the cost. They can, not because they do not feel it. They do. They do not stop because they have decided, individually, collectively, across generations and distances and losses that should break the will to continue. They have decided that the cost of stopping is higher than the cost of continuing. We have no entry for this. We have no framework for this. We recommend that this species not be approached as a military problem. We recommend that this species be approached as something we do not yet have a word for. Recommendation. Observe. Learn. Do not erase. There may be something here worth understanding. There may be something here worth knowing. There is a story that Sarah tells. Not the story she was born to tell. The accumulated history of her species. The names and battles and narrow escapes of 300 years. Those stories she tells too. She will always tell those. But there is one story she added to the collection herself. The first story she has ever added. The first new entry in a tradition older than she is. It is a short story. It goes like this. Once, a species looked up at the most powerful thing in the galaxy and said no. And the most powerful thing in the galaxy said, "That is irrational." And the species said, "Yes," and kept going anyway. And the galaxy, which had forgotten that keeping going was a choice, remembered and was changed. She tells it to the young ones now. The ones who grew up knowing only compliance, only smallness, only the managed diminishment of a species that had learned to fold itself into the shape the empire required. She tells it to them the same way the old man in Iceland read poetry, without apology, without explanation, without any apparent concern for whether the ships in the sky are listening, because some things are worth saying out loud, regardless if this story gave you something. If it reached some part of you that needed reminding that keeping going is a choice, that the calculation doesn't always get the final word, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do is look at something enormous and say no, comment HFY below, because that's what this was always about. Not aliens, not spaceships, not empires or weapons or tactical doctrine. It was about the thing that Yara told first in that meeting room. The thing that is not a variable. The value. The one that doesn't change when conditions change. The one that 38 people carried into the dark and left there for the rest of us to find. We are still finding it. We are made of it. Like this video if you stand with humanity. Subscribe if you want more stories about what we are capable of when we decide that the story isn't over. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that keeping going is a choice. And if you have a name that deserves to be said out loud, say it. We're listening. The galaxy was not prepared for what humans would do. It never is. That is exactly the point. The end.